Facepalm America. I'm Beowulf Rockland, facepalmamerica.com. Welcome. As usual, you can go to facepalmamerica.com and get all sorts of information about the show. You can message us if you like, or call us at 202-656-6271. And you can listen to past episodes of the program at facepalmamerica.com if you like. We know, and I think most people listening to the show understand, that housing discrimination against people of color has been a problem throughout the history of the United States. It's been openly enforced by law until relatively recently and continues to be undergirded by legal structures to this day. But fortunately, there are ways to fight against it. Leah and Richard Rothstein are the authors of Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law. And Richard Rothstein is also the author of The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Leah, Richard, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I know it goes back much further than this, but and if you want to pick a different starting point, let me know. But what was the state of housing and housing discrimination? What did it look like for people of color at the start of the 20th century, especially in American cities?
Well, at the start of the 20th century, most African Americans were still living in rural areas in the South. Right. So while there were some in urban areas in the North and the Midwest, they weren't very numerous. The federal government wasn't involved at all in housing at that time. So there were the few African Americans who were living in northern areas who were living in separate pockets, but not as rigid as it later became. The federal government first became involved in housing during the New Deal in the Roosevelt administration, during the Depression. And the federal government at that point imposed segregation on every urban area. So that's when the real excessive segregation came about. Were it not for those unconstitutional, unlawful federal policies implemented from 1933 on, we would have a racially egalitarian society today. We would have non-segregated neighborhoods. Of course, there was private discrimination. Private realtors, private developers, private banks, all would have, on their own, segregated the country, but they weren't on their own. They were all subsidized by the federal government and regulated by the federal government and the state government as well. And had the federal and state governments abided by their constitutional responsibilities, they would have told those developers, those realtors, those banks that they could not get federal subsidies unless they proceeded on a non-discriminatory basis. So the biggest example that I talked about in The Color of Law were the suburbs that were created in the post-World War II period. The biggest one was Levittown, east of New York City, 17,000 homes in one place. Levitt was a bigot. He would have kept African Americans out of that suburb if he could have done so on his own. But he wasn't on his own. He couldn't find the banking financing to buy the land and build that project. The only way he could do it was by going to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administrations, submitting his plans for the development and a required commitment never to sell a home to an African American. This was written out in a federal policy manual. The manual even said that a developer like Levitt or any other who was going to build an all-white project couldn't do so if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. So that's where it really intensified. And of course, it's established patterns that exist to this day, because those suburbs that were created, not just Levittown, but in every metropolitan area of this country, appreciated in value unexpectedly. The white returning war veterans, factory workers who moved into those modest suburbs didn't expect to get rich by doing so, but they did, because their homes spectacularly appreciated in value. Homes that the FHA and VA subsidized in Levittown and elsewhere in the country, every metropolitan area, sold in the mid-20th century for about $8,000, $9,000. In today's money, that's about $100,000. Those homes nowhere sell for $100,000 today. 200, 300, 400, $500,000, in some places $1 million or more. The white families who benefited from that unexpected appreciation used the wealth that they gained to send their children to college, to take care of temporary emergencies, to subsidize their retirements, and to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes.
Yeah.
African Americans were prohibited by explicit federal policy from participating in this program that generated wealth. And that's why we have a segregated society today with this enormous wealth gap that maintains its segregation.
Yeah, you can understand the implications that has for each successive generation. Let me ask you a question derived from some personal relation and interest. My grandfather was involved in the creation of Lakewood in California. Was the same legal system that undergirded the same discriminatory legal system that undergirded Levittown? Was it also involved in Lakewood as well?
Yes, it was. Lakewood is an example. There were others in California as well. Lakewood was an example. It was covered with restrictive covenants. There's deed clauses that prohibited resale to African Americans. Wow. And the FHA and VA financed it on a racially discriminatory basis.
How was it? I mean, what were I can certainly imagine, given the federal power that the South and the anti-black South held, in the Senate and other places on Capitol Hill, why that came to be, why through the New Deal and even post World War II, was that acceded to? Was there just no other way of getting it accomplished, or was that just the assumption that was made? What was the process for inserting that explicit racism into the legal structure?
No, it's an exaggeration to say that this was because of the Southern congressmen and senators.
Okay.
Certainly, they insisted on maintaining segregation in their states. But for example, although they segregated their schools, they didn't insist on northern schools being segregated. Mm-hmm. The federal government didn't have to kowtow to Southern Democrats, Dixiecrats, in order to segregate Levittown or Lakewood. Right. The Southerners wouldn't have objected to selling homes in those developments to African Americans. Now, if it did that in the South, you could say that the Dixiecrats would have prevented it. But this was not a simply something demanded by Southern Democrats.
Yeah, this was homegrown California racism, so to speak.
Well, federal DC, Washington D.C. Mm-hmm. is where it came from.
Yeah,
California as well. Look at the California licensed all the real estate agents who sold homes in those places. And if California was fulfilling its constitutional responsibilities, it would have lifted licenses from realtors who wouldn't sell homes in Lakewood to African Americans.
So let me ask, there are these big sections of major American cities that basically were off limits to African Americans and other people of color. What kinds of opportunity? I mean, was it just there were only essentially, for the most part, other specific places where people of color could live? Was that racial boundary ever crossed, at least up through the 1950s? And what opportunities were available to people of color to purchase houses, pass on generational wealth, etc.?
Well, there were no opportunities because the Federal Housing Administration would not insure mortgages for African Americans, either in Black urban neighborhoods or in the suburbs. The banks wouldn't issue conventional mortgages to African Americans. If they bought homes in Black neighborhoods, they did so with exploitative contracts that were not insured by the FHA or VA.
Okay. So they were just structurally at a financial disadvantage, even if they were buying and not renting, which I assume was much more rare.
Yes.
Right. So what began to change, and how did the Fair Housing Act come into play? What changes did that put into that landscape?
Well, the Fair Housing Act prohibited future discrimination.
Okay,
It
right.
did nothing to undo the segregation that had been created. So to use that example again, I don't want to belabor it, but it's true of every suburb in this country. When Levittown or Lakewood were created, they were affordable to African Americans, to factory workers, to returning war veterans. The Fair Housing Act said, in effect, okay, now you can live in Levittown. We're not going to stop you from doing so, but they're no longer affordable
Right.
unless the federal government and local governments take some action to compensate African Americans, to subsidize them, to move into suburbs that are no longer affordable to them. Of course, there are some who can afford to move into them. Levittown is not 100% white anymore, the 2 or 3% African American, but you'd expect in that region Levittown to be 13% African American. That's what the neighboring communities are. So the Fair Housing Act is incapable of remedying this without explicit redress for the past. Simply prohibiting future discrimination won't do it.
Were there other kinds of discrimination aside from the generational ones which you referred to, but other forms of active legal discrimination that the Fair Housing Act did not apply to and that continued?
I can give an example. A present policy that is in effect all over the country, the credit scoring system. It's a system we think of as racially neutral. It's not racially discriminatory in its intent or in its design. But how the credit scoring system works is that, gives you a rating of your future likelihood of repaying a debt based on your past financial performance. So if you've paid your debts on time, you have a high credit score. A high credit score means you qualify for a mortgage and you can get a good interest rate. If you have no credit score or a low credit score, you can't get a mortgage. And so it seems objective. It seems, racially neutral. But how it works is it's based on only a certain type of financial history feeds into the credit scoring system. It's a type of financial history that whites are far more likely to have than African Americans. It's the type of financial history that comes from traditional financial institutions. So if you have bank accounts with traditional banks or credit cards, or if you've had a mortgage in the past, all of that feeds into your credit score. But if you live in a predominantly African American neighborhood, no matter what economic status of that neighborhood, you have fewer bank branches in your neighborhood than a similar white neighborhood. That's, what we call financial redlining today, is that banks place fewer branches in segregated African American communities of all income ranges. And so you have less access to that traditional financial institutions. You might rely more on a payday lender than a credit card because you don't have access to traditional credit card and bank accounts. If you use a payday lender and you pay back those loans in full on time, even with their exorbitant interest rates, that financial history doesn't factor into your credit score.
Wow.
Similarly, if you've never had a mortgage, but you've been a renter your whole life, always paid your rent on time, that historically hasn't factored into a credit score. So by no fault of their own or no reflection of their own financial, qualifications to pay back a mortgage, African Americans are less likely to have a high enough credit score to qualify for a mortgage just because of how the credit scoring system is created. And so there's movement now where some of the credit scoring agencies, you can opt in to have your rental payment history counted towards your credit score. So there's some changes happening nationally on this. But what we talk about in Just Action is what we need is local action to get our local banks and financial institutions to adjust their credit scoring algorithms to have a more equitable outcome for African Americans seeking mortgages.
It's fascinating to me because not just even in the sense of housing discrimination or financial discrimination more broadly against people of color. I'm just trying to remember a time, and maybe there was a time